Every month, pharmacies get in touch with us to say they cannot buy the medicines that they need to buy at or below the drug tariff price. And so they'll say, I've seen the drug tariff price and I can't buy that anywhere. And they will ask us to get a change to the drug tariff price, a temporary change to drug tariff price. So we collate all of those inputs to us, and we test them, and we look out there at the market and we input them to the Department of Health, and they do their own analysis, and they then will say, okay, we will be issuing this month a number of price concessions where we have changed the price.
Welcome back to Behind the Counter, Pharmacy and Beyond, the podcast where real stories meet real business lessons. I'm your host, Solomon Abuede. In the last episode, I sat down with Nicola Goodberry-Kennelly, Chief Executive of Community Pharmacy West Yorkshire, for an honest conversation about what CPWI does for contractors, what the new contract settlement means on ground, and what the future of the sector looks like for those willing to adapt. Today, I'm joined by someone whose job is to sit across the table from government and negotiate on behalf of every pharmacy contractor in England. Janet Morrison OBE is Chief Executive of Community Pharmacy England, the body formerly known as PSNC. She joined in March 2022, coming not from pharmacy but from the charity and public policy world. She was awarded an OBE for services to older people and her efforts in establishing and chairing the campaign to end loneliness, and has led CPE through what has been, by any measure, one of the most turbulent periods in the sector's history. Welcome to the podcast, Janet. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Janet, before we get into the meaty part of this, let's talk a bit about your background. So, who is Janet and what have you done and what's led you to the role of Chief Executive at Community Pharmacy England?
Well, I've had a long career in policy, strategy and government relations. That's been my background. And I've worked in the public sector as well as the charity sector. So, for example, I worked in the BBC and I was responsible for our relationships with government department. And in that role, got the approval from government for BBC Online to be a licensed fee-funded service, and I got approval for joint ventures and new channels. And I've also worked in areas like science, technology and the arts, and got additional funding for that endowment that was there to fund creativity and innovation. But a substantive period of my life was also involved in charity. So I was chief exec of an older people's charity, and we ran a care homes group, and we lobbied and worked on strategy for social care and the future of that. So that was very important. As an older people's charity, we were very aware of the infrastructure in older people's lives, the places they go, the contact points that they have. And community pharmacy was very much a key part of that, both for individual older people and their carers, but also for care homes. But I think it more came to the forefront of my mind during the pandemic, when it was really obvious that pharmacies were the only open doors on the high street. I was the carer for my elderly father, and we were in a bubble together. And so I was responsible for getting hold of his medication, but just as critically taking him off for his vaccinations for COVID and flu. And that's when I think it really opened my eyes to the clinical service potential and the availability of pharmacy and its value to people. So when I was approached about this job out of the blue, and I thought, goodness, what do I know about community pharmacy and this strange named organisation, PSNC, I sort of thought, well, I'm not qualified to do that. But what they were looking for was the skills of policy, government affairs, building relationships and influence. And that was more important to them because they didn't want someone from one specific part of the sector, because we're pretty tribal. And if I'd worked for one part of the sector, everyone else would have been suspicious and vice versa. So they really wanted someone who could understand how government works and how to build relationships. And that is my skill. And I think that it's an important part of it, because every minister I've met, and I've met at least 4 so far, and I'll have a new one to meet shortly, they're not pharmacists. So I have to be able to translate our interests, our strategy, our issues into the language of policymakers and ministers, and to be able to do that effectively with them and their civil servants. So it's about translation sometimes, but it's also about understanding whose objectives you're trying to influence. So that's been a really steep learning curve nevertheless, because when I came in, the complexity of the contract and the funding arrangements, medicine supply, all of those things was quite mind-boggling, and my brain definitely hurt for the first 3 months, not least because day one, I was in negotiations for the next contract. So it was very steep learning curve. And I would say that I'm always learning and I'm always listening. And I go around and visit pharmacies and talk to pharmacy owners, and I'm always learning from the real issues for them on the ground, not just the highfalutin policy, but also how it really impacts on the ground.
Yeah. And that's fantastic. Obviously, a really great connection between sort of where you're coming from and where you are now. And there are a few things I want to pick out there, but I think it's important. You mentioned something there, which I think I need to get out of the way in order to sort of shape every other conversation we're having now.
Yeah.
You've mentioned about the reason why, or one of the reasons perhaps why you were approached was because effectively you didn't know about community pharmacy, and it can be tribal, like you mentioned. And you had mentioned or suggested that what PSNC at the time wanted was a transparent approach, so a neutral person effectively, which I think is crucial, and I can see why they wanted that. There's a question sort of within the contractor world, if you like, around who funds CPE. How is CPE funded? I'll ask the question directly. What goes around, and I don't know if this is true or not, is that the chief executive of Community Pharmacy England is a civil servant and appointed by the government. Is that true?
No.
No, that's okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm not a civil servant. Definitely not a civil servant. I'm appointed by CPE, and CPE is a body, a representative body that is recognised by Secretary of State to represent pharmacy owners. Okay. Our committee is made up of pharmacy owners, and there's 26 representatives from across the whole of the sector. The way we're funded doesn't come from public money, it comes from community pharmacies. So community pharmacies pay levies that go to LPCs, and then LPCs pay levies to us to fund community pharmacy. So we're completely independent of government. I wouldn't be able to do my job if they were my paymaster. So yeah, we're completely independent of them, but we're recognised by them because we're a representative body. We bring together a united voice for the sector, and that makes their life easier because they wouldn't want to have to go and negotiate with tons of different bodies. So we do an important job. We're recognised by the Secretary of State, but we're completely independent.
Great. And I think it's really important, and you probably agree with me, to get out of the window, because if there's anybody sort of listening to this episode as a contractor and this thing, because one of the things that contractors tend to say is, well, this is why we're not getting great contracts, because whoever's meant to be negotiating on our behalf is sort of with the government and everything. But I'm glad I've cleared that out. And then just sort of picking some of the things you said there, what I find really interesting is the link between your charity work and community pharmacy. And you've sort of mentioned that you realized that when everybody else was shut, GP surgeries were shut during the pandemic, the doors that remained open was the community pharmacies. And it might appear that you're totally distant from it, but the background you've got in care and the charity work you've done, I can see that link when you mention it, but that's something I wouldn't have pieced together, because in the community pharmacy, we're the heart of communities and we care. And in your previous role, you did a lot of that as well. So I think there's more similarities there than perhaps would show off initially.
Yeah, I mean, I think I ran a charity and we had a care homes group. So we were funded, some element of our care home was funded by the local authority. Local authority paid for some residents, and other residents were funded from their own private money. So we had to run that business in an economic way, and we had to make a return so that we could invest in the buildings and the infrastructure that residents needed. So I have an understanding of a mixed funding model, but it's for social purpose. And I think the important part about community pharmacy is they are businesses, but they're providing a public service. They're providing health services. And that's why we have the contract that we have. But they still need to be able to make a return so that they can pay themselves and their staff, but also they can invest in their future. So I don't think there's any kind of conflict with where I've come from. And in fact, one of the things we have to bear in mind, when we're very impassioned as a sector, for obvious reasons, a lot of people are under horrible, horrible pressures that are, impacting patients to some degree. But the really important thing is the reason we're funded is because of the services that we provide to patients and to communities. And I come from that perspective. So I sometimes ask awkward questions because I might say, but isn't that in the better interests of patients or whatever else? And if we're talking to government and we don't mention patients, we only mention I'm not making enough money, then we're missing the point, and we are not speaking to them because they think we only care about making a profit. And that's not true, because of course a lot of people aren't making a profit, but that's not true. So we have to keep an eye on what we're here for and why we're funded, and also be really clear about the public service we're providing. I think, I think there's lots of similarities, and I've come from a really significant patient group. Older people have to be one of the number one clients of the services community pharmacy provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is correct as well. And I do agree on the point that if you do lead with contractors not making money, then the government would feel it's not about the money, it's about the patients. And that's certainly a sensible way to go. And just sort of in the introduction, there's just one final piece that I found interesting. You referenced the name it used to be, PSNC, Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee.
Yeah.
Were you involved in the change? Was that your idea?
No, it wasn't my idea. But it was on the books. So there had been a large scale review about the future of community pharmacy and how to have more impact, how to have more influence, how to have more of a vision and a strategy for community pharmacy, and how to punch above our weight, I guess. And part of that had been a recommendation to change our name. In reality, in legal terms, we are still PSNC, but we operate under the name of Community Pharmacy England. And that is much more accessible because I spend a lot of time in Parliament talking to MPs and peers, policy makers. And to say I come from Community Pharmacy England is very clear what we do, given how many bodies there are in this sector. Whilst when you said you were from PSNC, no one had a clue what we did. So it definitely has helped us with our profile and the work that we're doing representing pharmacies.
Okay. No, thanks for clarifying that as well. So just sort of jumping into the meat of it now, then I'm going to start with the current, what's, I suppose, hot cake on the topic at the minute for community pharmacies, contractors. It's the opening hours. So we need to sort of dive into that and what's changed and why. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's been changes to the KORA regulations or the opening hour regulations. Now, I attended the webinar a few days ago, which was fantastic and had a lot of information. But even after that webinar, I was perhaps left with more questions than answers. And I don't think that's down to the quality or the delivery. The information was there. But for me as a contractor, and there will be contractors listening to this, I just want to know, in your own words, what is changing? Why has it happened? And is it really going to benefit people, or is it just the changes there? Because one of the things I took from the webinar is, yes, there are changes, but it's still really difficult to get those changes through in an application. So what's your view of the change?
Well, it was part of our negotiations last year that we proposed these changes to have an additional application route to be able to change your core hours, to give you greater flexibility to meet the needs of patients. And we proposed that during those negotiations because it was just too hard and there wasn't enough flexibility. And actually, during the negotiations process, we met with the minister and we talk about obviously the big level things about how much funding there is and how it's delivered. But also we talked about this and brought it up with the minister. And I said, look, pharmacies are businesses. If there were people there to serve, they would want to be open. But if there aren't people there and it's costing them to be open for hours where there's only one or two people coming in, we need to be able to have the route to be able to have that flexibility. And he said, yeah, why not? And actually made the difference in terms of moving the blocks and barriers to bringing in that change. But it still requires an application to the ICB, and there's definitely some issues with it in terms of whether they accept it, but also in terms of the appeals process. And it seemed clear to us that NHS Resolutions Appeal Committee are taking quite a restrictive approach to interpreting the regulations. So the vast majority of appeals aren't getting through. And there's quite a limited interpretation they're taking about the impact on patients. So they're saying, what's the impact on a patient, for example, at a weekend? If it's not available at the weekend, then will other hours or even supplementary hours meet that need? So we raised that again in this year's negotiations, and we asked for a reinterpretation of the regulations, and we weren't greeted with success on that with NHS England. So we are continuing to monitor it. We are aware of it. I think it's something we'll have to keep the pressure up in terms of future regulatory changes. But obviously that's not something that's administered nationally. It's administered through the ICBs, and their interpretations are sometimes quite different in different areas. So it is a challenging issue. We understand that.
Yeah. And just for clarity, Janet, can you just, for any contractor listening to this now, what exactly has changed? So what was it before and what can they now do?
I'm not on top of the details. All I can say is it's an additional application route through the ICBs. I think you'd have to speak to my colleague Gordon Hockey if you really want to know the ins and outs of how it works, because that's not that's too much detail probably for my skills and knowledge.
And that's absolutely fine. But in summary, what we're talking about here is it's usually, I think mostly it's the Saturday hours, isn't it? So I think from what I gather from the webinar, it's you're open 9 to 5 on a Saturday. Nobody comes in after 12 o'clock and you're there for 5 hours and you're not doing nothing. And I think you can redistribute those hours across or apply to close those hours and reduce it. So there is a movement in what your core hours can be. Previously, there wasn't a movement, your core or your core. But now my understanding is you can redistribute your core hours across the week where patients have need or where there's patient needs. And I think there's some flexibility there.
Yeah, so I think that's precisely right. And a number of people have succeeded. I know I had a member of my negotiating team from the committee who was very gung-ho about this issue, and he's definitely managed to change his hours, and I know a number have. But it just depends whether they're taking the viewpoint about being able to serve the majority of patients within the working week rather than making people stay open when it's uneconomic, which clearly doesn't make sense.
Yeah, okay. And in your opinion, do you think it's generally fit for purpose now, or are we just made it slightly less difficult?
I think we've made it slightly less difficult. What we find is where we try to seek regulatory changes, they take a little by little approach. They don't take a drastic approach. And so we have to keep pushing at it. So there are a number of things where you get a small concession, then you can build from there. They're very rarely very open to a lot of change. And so there's pretty much every negotiation we go into, there's pretty much some further regulatory changes that we'll seek to get. But they take quite a cautious and restrictive approach in NHS England.
I'm just trying to sort of picture what it's like with you sat across the government officials or representatives having this conversation, almost sort of thinking, for the health minister or the government representatives that you speak to, pharmacy is one part of a big, massive NHS. What is it really like in those meetings, having those conversations? Because we can be very insular in pharmacy, and I'm sure it's the same for everybody else. Because when I'm listening to, the contracts, the announcements that you guys make, I'm not really thinking about social services. I'm not really thinking about the doctors, the hospitals. I'm thinking pharmacy hasn't got enough or want more. But it must be difficult, challenging when you're sat there. What's it really like sat in front of the government officials?
I think if you want to influence and persuade someone, you need to understand where they're coming from and what their challenges are. And you still need to be able to make your case, but you need to understand that. So when you're talking to a minister, most of the time, for example, Stephen Kinnock was our minister for the last 2 years since the general election. He's just left and he's moved into a new Secretary of State role. But he was responsible for the whole of primary care. So that's doctors, dentists, optoms, us, and also for social care. And it's a huge brief to cover. So when you're going in there, and if you were to say community pharmacy, it's terrible, it's all dreadful and blah, 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 and ignore the fact that the NHS England's overall budget after the spending review is 3%. So that's the context they're working with. And they can't just go and get more from the Treasury. They had to get more for the cost of redundancies of staff in ICBs and all of that. And that was a big fight. So they've got 3% to play with, and you want more than 3%. You want more than all of the other people who've come to them and said, we've got a black hole in our finances. There are people who are not getting on cancer care pathways. There are people who are waiting, 2 years to get a hip replacement. And there are people who are on lists for heart operations that I once heard a cardiologist say it's a self-cleaning list after 2 years, i.e. after 2 years, I don't need to worry about them because they'll be dead, right? So this is the context. There's hospitals demanding a lot of resources. There's A&E departments demanding resources. There's doctors, dentists, optoms, there's us. And there's social care, which is going to be an even bigger priority now under Andy Burnham. So if you just say we're in crisis and we need more money, that's exactly what every single other part of the NHS is saying. So you need to understand that context, and then you need to say, why would the investment community pharmacy be important? And so the approach we took since the election is to say, community pharmacies demonstrated its ability to deliver clinical services that help patients, that reach out into every community. And those services relieve pressures on other parts of the NHS. So if you can't get a GP appointment, you can get pharmacy first, and you could get more from those services. So we have to sell solutions, not just problems, because everyone's got a problem and they heard it 10 million times. So we say we have solutions to offer, and we've demonstrated our efficiency and capability in delivering them at fast pace. But nevertheless, if you want all of this menu of things that we could do, we have to be able to stay open and keep the lights on. And so you have to understand that the foundations of this sector are crumbling, and we have delivered despite the funding that we've received. So actually you need us to be sustainable, because fundamentally what scares them most of all is the thought that people won't get their medications. And we are at the end of the supply chain where we're dealing directly with patients. So it's really critically important. And I would say the last settlement, the last negotiation we did, the reason why there's an uplift to the margin allocation, the reason why they wrote off over delivery of margin was because they were nervous about medicine supply. They were nervous about patients being pushed from pillar to post and not getting their medication. So we have to tell that story about the solutions, clinical potential, but also the risk that we're taking with patients' health and access to medication if we don't stabilise the sector. So those are the kind of arguments we have to make. But we are really, community pharmacy, in the big scheme of things, Yvette Cooper got appointed as the Secretary of State for Health this week. Community pharmacy will not have come on her mind, as even the 10th thing she thought of when she thinks about her health brief.
And I appreciate that, because I think it's context, isn't it? Because for everybody in it, and when you're sort of going about, and you said a lot in there, and the things I definitely agree with in terms of the approach that you've got to go. We've got to be seen as delivering value, and we've got to be seen how we're saving other areas and other sectors. If we do this, we can save you money on there. But when again, from a contractor and sort of from pharmacy generally, when we're looking at it now, and other things that get said in conversations, you mentioned around the nervousness and the reason why the government, part of the reason why they've agreed what they've agreed, and writing off some of the previous debts and stuff. But I think what I see, and this was definitely before you, I think it was about 5 or 7 years ago, the headline announcement from PSNC at the time when the contract got negotiated and got agreed at the time, I can't remember exactly when, was that we have gone to the table to negotiate, but we knew if we didn't agree what was given to us, then would not get anything. And I remember thinking at the time, that's not a way to go to the negotiating table, because you've got a lot that pharmacy, I do appreciate pharmacy might not be at the top of your people's list, but there is a lot that pharmacy is doing when it comes to pharmacies. And I think under your stewardship, I think CPE understands that and is leveraging that correctly, based on what you said. The other thing that people would say is, what about dentists? Dentists have got a better contract than us, or they've not even got a contract, and it just
Can anyone how many people can get NHS funded dental care? People are taking their teeth out with pliers at home. So, I mean, you meet the dentists. I mean, I meet with them regularly. So I meet with all of the primary care bodies, the dentists. Sorry, I interrupted you, but the dentists.
No, it's absolutely fine.
I meet with the dentists, the GPs and the optoms on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, but we swap notes. Honestly, this is not a group of people who are cheerful and thinking they're getting great funding. They got, about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was in this role, the dentists lost 400 million of their funding that was clawed back from them because they hadn't delivered on what was required. And I remember saying to the Civil Servant, "Oh, can we have that?" And she said, "You'd already had 200 million of it." So the basic fact is, everyone always thinks everyone else is better funded. And previous to the last few years, that is absolutely true. Community pharmacy was cut when others kept going with inflation. So we have definitely been underfunded. For 10 years, we went backwards, 30% real terms cuts. But we have switched the dial to some extent in terms of we've had additional funding. It's not enough, but we have had additional. And they're not very pleased about it, I can tell you that. Because, the GPs this time got 4.6%, and the dentists got less than that, and we've got 10.3%. It's not enough, but it is a lot more than they've got. And that's because we've made the case both of the value of community pharmacy, the risk of destabilisation, and also the benefit of the clinical services that we can deliver. So we have changed the dial, but also really critically, the whole sector has raised awareness in Parliament amongst MPs and everywhere else. Closures, concerns, struggling with funding, all of those things. MPs all the time are coming to events, are raising it with ministers, and that increases the post bag. And it's raised concern about, if a pharmacy closes in my constituency, I'm going to get a lot of complaints. I need to raise this. So I think all of that adds to the importance of community pharmacy. We've made it much more visible and less taken for granted. But we did have serious cuts. We're starting to get some better deals now, but they're not guaranteed because the government's got so little money, and, there are pressures on their budgets.
I think there definitely has been a lot of work that's been done, and we're headed in the right direction. I mean, for example, I said this in the last episode with Nicola. I think we've got the biggest funding from across the health sector in the last budget. So I think those are things that sort of showing we're headed in the right direction. And I do think as well, the more we can do, it's about showing value. The more we can do, pharmacy first, independent prescribing coming in, the less pressure we can ease on all the sectors. Then we can, like you've suggested there, we can have an argument to say, listen, we're doing it. We can take it off them, and we can, they can take the pressure off. So I'm moving on to something else now, because we've talked quite a bit about that, and we'll sort of look at the patient aspect to it. Price concession, and this is a big one. Now, I'm going to do this in 2 parts. For the listeners the contractors are listening to this, if there are any out there that don't know what price concession is, can you just talk us through exactly how the system works? What is price concession? And if once we sort of get our heads around that, then we can sort of look at, okay, is it working, and what could be done differently about it? So what exactly is price concession, and how is it?
So every month, pharmacies get in touch with us to say they cannot buy the medicines that they need to buy at or below the drug tariff price. And so they'll say, I've seen the drug tariff price and I can't buy that anywhere. And they will ask us to get a change to the drug tariff price, a temporary change to drug tariff price. So we collate all of those inputs to us, and we test them, and we look out there at the market and we input them to the Department of Health, and they do their own analysis, and they then will say, okay, we will be issuing this month a number of price concessions where we have changed the price. So we've increased the price, but often there's a huge range of prices that people are paying. So some people will say, I can't get this drug that's listed for £5 for anything less than £30, and someone else will say, I can't get it for £10. So it won't please all of the people. And the problem is that an indicator of the pressures on the sector is when those number of price concessions get really high. And we have now, for the last 4 consecutive months, been at a record level of price concessions. So in June, there were 257 price concessions agreed by the department. We will have asked for more than that, but they wouldn't have put them all in. And that has quite a big impact in terms of it does influence supply a bit. So what we would be concerned about is that there seems to be a shortage, or there's a lot of demand, can't get it at that price, and then suddenly the price concession goes up, and then the medicine's available. So that suggests that there may be a bit of interesting buying practices going on. I think that the market, I think price concessions is a symptom of the fact that there's not enough money in margin, effectively. That's what it is. And therefore, we are being squeezed too tight on what we're allowed to retain as an effective margin on our good buying. And so what it's showing is there needs to be more money in margin, and that's been true. Margin was set at 800 million for about 8 years, I don't know, a very long period of time, and it went up last negotiations, and it's gone up this negotiation by 200 million to 1.1 billion. If you think about it, that's roughly, we do slightly more dispensing than that. So that's about £1 a prescription. So that can't possibly be enough. If you get £1.52 as well for your SAF, you're getting just under £2.50 for every drug that you dispense. And that's supposed to pay for all your core costs. Doesn't work. So effectively, over the years, the number of lines that we've been dispensing have grown, but the amount of margin didn't. And the sign of it is that there's so many price concessions coming through. Now, the problem with the price concessions is if there's loads of them, what will happen is some people didn't get in touch with us because they could buy the drug at that price. Some people will now be, you'll be able to buy better. But what will happen is the government will then say there's been an over delivery of margin. And so it creates this vicious cycle of boom and bust. So the higher the number of price concessions, the more likely they are to say there's been over delivery of margin. And what will happen then? They'll push down the drug tariff. So it creates a cycle, but ultimately it's about how much money is in margin that pharmacies can retain to keep their business afloat.
It sounds to me like, and you mentioned earlier on at the beginning as well, that you inherited a complex contract, and that's what this sounds like to me, because I think you are right about I'm listening to you then, and you're thinking in more price concession there is then in a few years or months, whatever, we'll turn around and the government will say, well, there's been an over delivery of margin, and then there's a margin, there's sort of the discount deduction, that's going on as well. And there's just sort of so much going on around. And certainly I think the contract, and I've said this for as long as I can remember, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, I don't think the contract is fit for purpose. And I do think that there needs to be so much that needs to be looked at in that, but that's a separate topic. Just sort of going back to, so just a starting point, price concessions determine when you started by saying pharmacists get in touch with community pharmacy in England.
Yeah.
Now, how do pharmacists do that, or should pharmacists do that? Because that seems like the driving point. That's, you don't know what's going on until pharmacists tell you.
Well, but a lot of people are getting in touch with us, because I can tell you, for one, if there were 257 price concessions in June and a similar level in the previous 3 months, a lot of people are getting in touch with us.
230 in May.
Yeah, so it's at a high level now, but you just go through the website, look at CPE website. There's a bit on it for price concessions, and it will tell you how to submit to us. And so we pick that up, and the team work on it all the time. One of the problems is those price concessions don't last for very long. So then you have to redo it again next month. And this is a topic. We have a long list of topics about how to improve the margin system and whether it is the right system and whether there are alternatives. But we've got a huge number of topics. That is one thing that we think price concessions should go on a bit longer. But government aren't so keen that. We should think if it's agreed at the end of the month, it should continue into the next month. But we've got a lot of lists of ways to do it. But definitely people should get in touch with us and let us know. And we'll make those submissions.
The timing of it is another thing that frustrates a lot of contractors, and you sort of described the way it works there, and you can almost see it, because as I'm sure you're aware, we go in at the beginning of the month and we're buying blind. And I'll give you an example. You probably have this already. Sort of May into sort of end of May into the whole of June, ezetimibe went above tariff. Tariff price in June was 94p a pack, right? And the cost of ezetimibe that we could get for in our branches at some point went as high as £22 a pack. So that's buying it at, £21.06 loss straight up.
Yeah.
Concession didn't come in for ezetimibe. The first time it appeared on the concession list was on the 30th of June. That's the last day in June. And what's happened is we spent parts of May and all of June buying this drug at £22. To be fair, it ranged from £7 to £22 and sort of moved across, which is what you mentioned earlier. And there's a variant, and that's between one organization. So we've gone through the whole month, and on the last day of the month, it goes in concession. But as you're aware, the concession's only approved for that month. So in theory, if I've picked data from one of my branches here, but we've dispensed 70 packs. It's not a business branch, 70 packs of ezetimibe in the month. And majority of those may have been done in the last week. And as a result, when the 5th of July comes, you can't claim for it in that month with the June prescription anymore. We then get into July, and when ezetimibe did go on concession, it was at £6.99 at the end of June. But then on the 17th of July, it's dropped down to £4.64. Now, the price has dropped. It's no longer at the high price of £22. But my question is, if we're getting the concession list at the last day of the month, and if the concession price is only valid for that month, then effectively what we've done is just bought at a loss for the month. And that's surely a problem.
Yeah. I mean, totally agree. We've just been around the country at regional meetings with contractors, and we asked them about the number one thing that needs to be solved, and it's dispensing at a loss. And as part of our contractual settlement for this year, at 26-27, we said we need a reform program to pick up more of our proposals for improving the system, and that's definitely one of the number one things. I think it's the biggest priority we have, is to address the margin system and how it's working. But price concessions are a function of, firstly, how much money there is in the market, but also we've got change in buying behaviours too, because we have more independent, a higher proportion of the market now are independents rather than multiples. The multiples would buy in bigger bulk, and that created some stability. Buying platforms are absolutely prevalent and vital to many businesses, but they can then also mean that people start hearing a rumour or seeing a price go up, and they are changing their buying behaviours. So they may buy. I was visiting a pharmacy the other week. It was saying, I buy more stock now than I used to buy because I'm concerned that prices may go up. So if you start buying more, and that's a perfectly logical thing to do, that happens across the board. The rumours go round and there's more buying, and it creates a seeming shortage. It seems like a shortage, so it creates that demand. The prices will go up, but it's not actually a shortage. There's enough of the drug in the country but it's becoming unavailable because it's been bought up in bulk or it's being held by people. And then it may be that there's some gaming that people hold on to it till the price concession comes and then it becomes available again. So that's not an efficient system. And we have to think about, and this is what we're looking at in terms of longer term reform is, the government have put 200 million more into margin. Will that ease the pressures? Or is it such that the way that the market is operating now is problematic and that we might need a different approach, and therefore are there alternative models? But those are not easy options, because if you said tomorrow the government, suddenly decided we're not going to do margin anymore, we'll do something different, to switch over to a whole new buying system or a whole new funding system is a massive potential destabilization of medicine supply. They don't have extra money for running things, double running one old system with a new system, all of that. So that's very problematic. But fundamentally, what you've said is absolutely true. Number one concern is dispensing at a loss, and pharmacies cannot see how what they're earning at the end of the month has any relationship with what they were doing to buy the medicines most effectively. So something's got to shift, and the question is it small scale shifts or is it big scale shifts that we need?
Do you think the suppliers are implicit in this? So, because I'm looking at it and I think about this a lot, obviously I'm on ground, and what you've described as one of the things that happens. There's a demand and supply element of it.
Yeah.
The rumors bit, I have had, suppliers ring up and say, this is going out of stock. You then sort of think to yourself, okay, how do they know it's going out of stock? Or the buyers told them. So the sales rep rings you and said the buyers informed them it's going out of stock. Then is it the manufacturer that's informing the buyer that it's going out of stock? And then, like you say, what happened is all of a sudden, the prices jump up, and after a few weeks or months, it all sort of goes back down again, and everybody's now sort of stocked up on it. And pharmacies would always buy it because we're caring about the patients. We're thinking, okay, if my patient hasn't got this medication, and I think it's almost like something needs to happen from either the manufacturer supply stage. And I look at it and I think, is the issue the fact that the drug tariff prices, which is obviously what the Department of Health has negotiated, with the manufacturers effectively, is that too low? Is that the problem? And is their supply costs higher? And then therefore they're going to try and make it, because can we not stop them? Can we not cap what they charge? Am I thinking about it too simplistically?
There could be other systems to be introduced. The government don't negotiate the prices with the wholesalers. The market sets the prices. The government determines what it thinks is appropriate pricing compared
how
with,
do they determine
with the
that?
pattern.
How do they determine that?
I really don't. Some of my colleagues could probably explain that to you in more depth, but I don't know how they do it. But I would say there is probably gaming in the system, absolutely, and there is going to be, and that could be across the board. And some of the people I represent are wholesalers as well, right? So it could be at any point in this supply chain, but it's not working effectively. The government has the capability to be able to see manufacturers' prices, wholesalers' prices, and through the margin survey, what we're paying. So they have the capability to be able to see all of that, but they don't influence and interfere. Apart from price concessions are setting the drug tariff, they don't interfere in that, but there may be more that they could do. But we've got to kind of probe that to say, are there better ways to run the system? But what I would say is Medicines UK, who represent manufacturers, whatever, of drugs, have absolutely made the point that there needs to be more money in margin to safeguard supply to patients. So they're on side with the fact that we've been underfunded for so long that this is creating a dysfunctional market that isn't working effectively. So something has to shift, but it might be more money or it might be different approaches to either interference in the market or indeed the way that it's funded. But you could end up, I've heard it mentioned, government could say, we'll do central procurement then, shall we?
I was going to say that.
Do you think they're capable of doing that? I'm not sure I'd trust the government to, they've struggled with hospital procurement of medication. That's not worked out terribly well. I don't think the government could take it on, but they could threaten it, or they could say someone else could do it. But we've done it very, very efficiently, but it's just the dysfunction now. they're getting nervous about it, and it's impacting on patients and on contractors too.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial thing. I think something does need to change, and I think we agree on that, because for me, it's very much a case of if you're getting the drug tariff, wherever the government's getting the drug tariff prices from, and that makes sense now, because if they're not negotiating it, we're not sure where they're getting it from, but it seems like they're getting the drug tariff price from somewhere. And in all fairness to the manufacturers or the suppliers, the cost of manufacturing might have gone up. When you look at a lot of drug tariff prices of medicines, they've barely moved in the last decade for a lot of medications, but the cost of living has gone up. We all know that. There's been the war in Ukraine and Russia. There's been the COVID pandemic. There's been all sorts that's happened in the world, and surely the cost of manufacturing has gone up. And I think that's one place where the problem really sits, because if the drug tariff isn't matching that, the suppliers are going to sell at a price. Now, the government cannot control what they sell at, then we end up in the position that we're in.
Yeah, but as you said, it's a global supply chain. How is it possible that drugs that are manufactured in China or in India are on sale for £1 in the UK? How is that possible that you could it doesn't make sense, does it? But that is what's happened. And actually part of it is that there's been a downward pressure on pricing because of the competition in the way that pharmacies have operated. It's worked really efficiently.
Yeah.
But it now means in a global supply chain, are we a preference market for some manufacturers, or would they rather go someplace else because they're going to get more than £1? So those are the challenges. But the Department of Health have responsibility to look at the resilience of the whole supply chain, not just our tiny bit at the end of it, the whole supply chain. And they do that, and they monitor that very closely. And I've got a colleague who goes along to those meetings and understands what's going on, but it's much bigger than us. So it's a bigger question. So, and a complex question. But the reality was they held us down on what we could earn for many, many years. But maybe if you went back 10, 12, 15, 20 years, no one had a problem with the margin system because it was better funded. So that's what we need to get to it. Is it the margin system that's the problem, or the lack of funding for it?
So I think it's more the margin. I think the margin system creates the problem, because if the margins fix is correct, then you've got less problem on the other end.
Yeah.
And you look at what's happening with COVID and the meningitis B vaccination service, and we'll talk about procuring stock centrally. That's not really worked, and I can see a nervousness around that, because that sort of caused a lot of issues as well. But maybe that sort of was being tried, because obviously it's happened with COVID. Now it's happening with the meningitis B vaccination service.
There are always supply issues, right? And that happens with most. Most years there will be some issue. We will get a lot of people upset about the supply of vaccine, whether it's, flu and all of that, or men being more recently. I just don't know personally. Would you trust the government to buy 1.1 billion drugs each year? I'm not sure I would. I think it's a pretty difficult job to do, and I'm not sure government's the best place to do it.
It is a difficult job to do, but I think as a contractor, and this is perhaps selfishly or looking at it from the contractor lens, what would be different, what would be refreshing, is to be able to look at patient in the eye and say the reason why you can't get your medication is because the government has messed it up. Then the pressure then hits at that point, because the other thing that we've got to bear in mind here is the pressure on the pharmacy teams on ground. And I know you go up and down the country and you would see that firsthand. Yeah. And when people come in and threaten all sorts, they think it's because it's you don't want to buy it, you don't care, you want to make profit, you want to do this. And I think that narrative needs to change, because there's only so much you can say to patients, and it is really, really tough on ground. Pharmacies are doing a lot more. They're buying at a loss, they're operating at a loss. I know a lot of contractors that remortgaging their homes. Effectively, what we've done over the last 5-10 years is we're funding pharmacies. And you, like I said, you have done a lot of work with CPE, or in your role as CPE, to sort of change that. And we can see that's changing. But I think there is a lot more that can be done. And I know you agree with me on that. Yeah,
totally. I mean, our Precious survey showed that 86% of pharmacies said they're spending more time on trying to procure drugs, and 72% said it's impacting patients. And it definitely is. it's not a perfect system. So we've got to look at changing it. And I think that is our number one priority for reform programme.
Yeah. Thank you for sticking with me this far in this episode of the podcast. If you really enjoy what you're watching here today, or on any of our previous episodes on Behind the Counter Pharmacy and Beyond, please remember to share, subscribe, and like. Doing that will help us reach more people. And if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, any guests you'd like us to invite, or any questions for any of our future guests, please feel free to drop us a message, and we'll do our very best to ensure that we'll put that out there for you. Yeah. Thank you.
And again, similar, just sort of talking about the medicine supply chain, you've got the issue of the Korean, for example, and HRTs that have been on SSPs for, I think, HRTs have been on SSP since 2024, December 24, and Korean since May 2024. Obviously, SSP is not designed to be on there for that long. What's going on with that? What is it, the manufacturers?
Yeah, but the reason for why there are shortages there are different reasons each time. So Creon is an issue about the raw ingredients being available for manufacturers. So that's a shortage of raw ingredients for a medication. And that is a global issue, and it's an issue it's affecting lots of countries because there's just not enough of the raw ingredients. And it's probably made a little bit worse by Brexit, but it's a global issue. HRT was an entirely different issue. HRT was because NICE changed their prescribing guidance, and so suddenly many more women, God bless them, got HRT prescribed. And what the wholesalers and the distributors would say was, it would have been nice if someone had told us that they were planning to do that. So suddenly that created a massive demand and a shortage because the market wasn't ready for how many more people had been prescribed it.
It's been 2 years though.
Yeah. There's only, I think, 7 SSPs at the moment. That's considering how many thousands of medications, are prescribed every month. That is a very tiny proportion. And I don't think, what can you do about Creon if they haven't got the ingredients to make Creon?
Yeah.
It's not government. That's not the government's responsibility. It's not our responsibility. That's a fact. And if the market is taking time to gear up to be able to provide to this market compared with France or Germany or America or somewhere else, to gear up to get supply into this country. Again, that's a more global market issue than it is an issue in terms of the system that the Department of Health is responsible for with community pharmacy. So I'm not hearing from my colleagues or from the department that this is an alarmingly high number of SSPs. They are there for a while, but that's been for reasons that they understand. And I think that's Department of Health's responsibility to look at the resilience of the supply chain and see if there are other things that can be done to improve manufacture, to improve approval of drugs, to enhance the way that delivery through the system works. But we're really at the tail end of that system.
Yeah, I think what's important not to get lost in as well is the data around the SSP, Janet, because there might be 7 lines for the HRT and SSP, but there are loads more. I mean, we've picked up Creon and HRT, for example, but there are a lot of medications that contractors simply cannot get and are not on SSP.
Yeah.
What do contractors do?
Well, would you prefer them to be on SSPs then and have more SSPs? Or
I think I'd prefer them to be available.
But as I said, the Department of Health has looked at what we regard as shortages. There's enough drug in the country, and I wouldn't say this because you've made a really good point about patients and how they take it out on us. They might be in that guy's warehouse down the road from you.
And this is that's the point. Because I'll tell you what else is happening. Creon 10,000 is sort of comes in and out, and we can get that. 25,000 has been out for a while, but every so often, and I had this about 2 weeks ago, a patient comes in and says they have rang the manufacturer for Creon, and they've told them there's no supply issues and they're supplying into the relevant channels. Now, that then begs a big, massive different question. And that's why I asked the question earlier. And do we even need to be here? Is there a real issue in the system that we're missing totally? Because like you say, Creon might be sat in somebody's warehouse somewhere.
I don't think Creon is. I mean, honestly, I don't think Creon is. I may be wrong, but I think there's definitely been a supply issue because of them from the manufacturer abroad.
Yes, there has been a supply issue.
But some of the other ones that aren't on SSB.
Like I say, Creon's come back in at 10,000 sort of in now. We can get those 25,000 still out. It then begs the question, okay, is it the same ingredient, different ingredient? But that's besides the point. There's a bigger issue with that. But in terms of, there are loads of other medications, and there are people here evidently playing the system and manipulating the system for gains, for profits. And should the government, the regulatory bodies, are they looking for those people? Are they looking for those things? Should they be doing more? Because patients are suffering. We're saying PSNC or CPE can do better. We're saying the government can do better, but there might actually be no issue because a lot of manufacturers confirm we've got no supply issues. We're delivering into AH. We're delivering
to say that I could solve the medicine supply chain myself would be a bit ambitious. There might be a range of solutions there. But as I said, one of the issues is buying habits, and it's having buying platforms that might be triggering any pharmacy to buy more than they previously bought, and that could create a local supply issue or rising prices or whatever. So it's a complex issue, and the government has responsibility for that. That's beyond us. But we do monitor the price concessions, and we will look at whether the margin system is the right way to pay for drugs. But broader than that, that's a much bigger challenge and a much bigger issue than is for community pharmacy.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Janet. Just moving on to the settlement, 2026 settlement and the funding crisis then. So obviously we've touched on it previously. I touched on it quite a bit in detail on my last episode. Some fantastic work that's been done by CPE in terms of sort of agreeing on what's been agreed. And I think there will be huge relief, certainly with the write-off on there. But CPE accepted it, but in your own statement, you made very clear that accepting it does not mean it's enough. And one that without structural reform will continue to see closure, reduced hours, deteriorating quality, and avoidable harm to patients. So what does 10.3% uplift actually really mean for a typical contractor in real terms? And why do you think it's not enough?
Okay, so bear in mind, the previous settlement that we got with the new government was 19%. And that was for 2 years. And this year it was 10%, 10.3%. Basically, we negotiated really hard. We got the write-off. We got some other changes to the way the money was going to be spent. We got some other concessions. But what the committee had to weigh up was, what does that cover? And what we reckoned was, in terms of activity and inflation growth, that's probably needed 9% to just deal with that growth over the coming year of costs and activity. So 10.3 is not going to do anything significant towards closing the funding gap. And the independent economic review that we asked for and was commissioned by NHS England showed that there was a much greater funding gap than either last year's settlement or this year's settlement would cover. So that's the reason it was a very difficult decision as to whether to accept it. And the committee knew there's lots of very strong voices saying we have to do something and do something stronger. But the reality was that they also had to weigh up who decides how much money we get. And that's the government, that's ministers. And ministers have given us, in the previous year, they gave the 19% was the best settlement across the whole of the NHS. And this year, 10.3% was the best settlement across the whole of primary care, and considerably more than the 3% NHS was getting overall. And so what they had to weigh up was, ministers have been prioritising community pharmacy, and they have been trying to get as much as they can to invest in community pharmacy. So if we say no to the best deal in primary care, what are they likely to do next year? Well, they're not going to prioritise us. They'll put it somewhere else where that's accepted. So we felt like, the committee felt that it's not enough to close the funding gap, but to close the funding gap would require, say, 45% funding increase. That's not realistic. This is better than average. We bank it and we try to build on it with maintaining that government commitment. But at the same time, we do need to address some of the bigger problems. We've just talked a long time about margin and medicine supply. We've now got to address those as well. And so we've got that commitment to reform as well. So I think they made a realistic and pragmatic decision to stay on side with ministers who are backing us and to build on that and to get some more fundamental changes than say no. And one of the big debates my committee had that day as they sat in this room, lots of people changed their minds several times on that day, was what's the strategy after you say no? Right, you feel better, you're angry, then what do you do? Where do you go from there? Because you've just lost the ear of the ministers who gave you that deal. Then where do you go? And no one could articulate a strategy of where their no takes you.
Do you really think the ministers will walk away from the table negotiating with community pharmacy?
Why would they give you? So if you came in as a new minister now and you were told these people got 19% last year and they got 10% this year, but they turned it down. They would wait, and they've got hospitals, ambulances, social care. They've got doctors, dentists, whatever else, much higher profile issues in the public's mind than pharmacy. And they say, well, we won't waste our money there. Of course, I'll put it somewhere else. And that's why one of the important parts of the deal this time was to put the Pharmacy First budget into the core contract, because that Pharmacy First budget was originally part of the primary care recovery plan, which was primarily focused at GPs. And it was vulnerable because at any point they have a new cunning idea for investing in GPs that would have gone away. So you can't just say, if you say no, that someone's going to go, oh, I want to carry on doing business with you, when they've got such a clamour and pressure on them from every other part of the system. Why would they give it to us again? They'd go back to, you can have 2% or 3% like everyone else.
If we say no, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, not telling you how to do your job, because I know as we started, there's a lot more to it. It's more than pharmacy. But if we say no, they say no, they walk away, and they offer us 2% or whatever it is as less, and we say no to that again, and pharmacies start to close, and every electorate in their constituency is knocking on the MP's doors. The MP saying, if another pharmacy closes, my constituents are going to have me. Does that not turn up the heat, and does that not put us in a position? Because without us, you can't buy a box of 32 paracetamol if a pharmacist is not present.
Oh, well,
if a pharmacist closed.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, it's my committee who decide this as to whether they want that. That's playing chicken, isn't it? That's like saying, okay, let's see what happens. And some of you in this room may close, but that's fine, because then they'll learn their lesson. The doctors have had their deal imposed for the last 3 years. Last time around, in the negotiations that the GPs have just done, the government didn't even wait for the GPs to vote. They imposed it without bothering. Right? Has it worked for GPs that the government said, oh my God, we haven't got enough GPs, we haven't got enough of this, we haven't got enough of that, and they've suddenly given them more money? No, they've just carried on doing what they want, because if you're not going to say yes, we don't need to work with you, we'll tell you what you've got and that's it. So that's the risk you take, and that's playing chicken, isn't it? But all the power, the problem is all the power is with the commissioner, and they have 10 million other things that are important to them to do. So no one in this room, in my committee room that day, could actually say, and then what happens after 3 years? Let's say loads of people close and then there's a big clamour, and what will happen? Well, contractors like yourself may well have gone out of business, but that doesn't matter, because those that survive, who are doing better now because they've got the sustainability, will be okay.
Yeah, I mean, contractors are going out of business anyway, and I know that we're on the same page with this, Janet, and you agree with what I'm saying, but again, in your role, you've got to look at it, because it's an interesting one for you, isn't it? If you go into that room and you say, no, we're not taking it, then there will be contractors having you thinking, well, now I'm going to have to close because you didn't take that deal, and now this is happening. So you can't really win both ways. But I'm just sort of looking at it and thinking to myself, I'm like, are we blinking too soon? Can we do more? Can we order more? Because when I look at community pharmacy, you mentioned the doctors there. The doctors are in a totally different position. Community pharmacies are doing a lot more and spending a lot of personal money to run the businesses at a loss and carrying a lot more weight. We started the episode today by talking about how during the pandemic, the doctors all shut their doors from day one or day zero. close the doors, don't come in, phone us, whatever it is. The pharmacists are the ones that were at the heart of it and going through it. So I think for those reasons, we're not asking, I think it's a 40-something% is what we need. We're not asking to get to that point. We appreciate that there's a finite amount of money, and we appreciate there's a big, massive department that is the NHS to spread that money across. But I think when you look at what pharmacy contractors have had to endure over the years, we would always put our patients first. And rightly or wrongly, maybe that is the problem. We would always put our patients first. Now, every single contractor across the country has been doing that at a significant loss, personal loss for some of them. I know people that have lost homes personally. I know people that have, done things for that. So I just think and I know it's not that black and white, like I said, in those negotiations. That's why I asked earlier on what is it like sitting across the room, but it's just something that I'm sure every contractor thinks about. But I also do appreciate you've got to take what you can get and make progress. And certainly with the last CPCF contract, there's been huge progress.
Well, I guess that the committee decide, and the committee are all contractors. I don't decide. I'm not a contractor. I don't decide. The committee decides. So they weigh up what they think the best answer is. And I think that there is absolutely no guarantee that there is going to be loads more money, because we know at the moment that the government has massive funding pressures. They've got about 5 billion they haven't funded yet for the defence bill, and probably we need our country to be able to defend itself. So they've got to find that money. They've just we've got no growth in the economy. We've got the impact of the UK drug trade deal that's going to have an impact as well. And they've now said they want to sort out social care. That comes with a very hefty bill. So I'm not super confident that there is just loads of money out there. The NHS only had 3% overall, and it may be that some of that was front loaded at the beginning of this term. But what the committee were concerned about was we have had the first time we got a positive funding deal was from this new government. Yeah. They were listening, and it was 19%, and the second deal was 10%. The first time, none of the other ministers I met previous to that even said they were going to try to get more funding. And so finally, someone is listening to your cause and is saying, and I think Stephen Kinnock genuinely did, he said, I'm going into bat for community pharmacy, and he fought to get money to put into pharmacy. And I think that many of the committee felt, after crying into the wind for the last 8 years of real terms cuts, finally someone is listening to us, and at least we have, whilst we're in the room with them, we have the potential to influence them. Once you're cut out of that room, and that happened before, we took the government to court, however many years ago, with judicial review. They didn't bother to speak to the sector for the next 2 or 3 years. They just imposed. So that's the loss, and that's what the committee weighed up. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. There are people on my committee who are in exactly the same boats you've just described. No one takes it lightly because they feel the pain. They represent people who are feeling the pain. They know exactly what the reality is, but they've just got to weigh up. Would you rather still be able to talk to people, or do you want to be sent out into the cold? And the other bit I'd say is there are other sector bodies who can do different things to us, right? Who will be more vocal, more aggressive. And so long as they are amplifying the messages that we're giving, then, and we're speaking with one voice, we're not fighting each other, but we're making that case, then there are people who can be more, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, if Wes was cross with the MPA, which he was, because they said they were going to take all these actions. It didn't matter, because we could still be in the negotiating room, and MPA don't have to negotiate. And if IPA or CCF, whatever, want to do whatever they want to do, or ICPN or whoever, then that's fine. So long as they're amplifying the message, we're not fighting like rats in a sack. But if that amplifies the message, that's great. But to lose the chance to be in the room for the first time when you've been listened to, that's a very brave person who says, I think I'd rather play chicken and see what happens. And maybe if more of us collapse more rapidly, that they'll suddenly change and give us loads of money for the survivors. Meanwhile, some of the people in my negotiating room and in LPCs and in your world have closed. I don't know. So that's the choices. It's not straightforward. And, if there was an obvious answer, everyone would be doing the right, doing that, and then we'd have loads more money, wouldn't we?
Yeah. Absolutely. It certainly isn't straightforward. And here's the question then, Janet. If the government cannot or will not fund pharmacy to the level that's required, what should contractors be doing? How do we survive it?
We won't ever advise anyone on their business strategy. And obviously there are bodies who are better able to do that. But one of the things that I was told when I was going around the country in our regional meetings, after the deal, was that some people said we have become, over the last 20, 40 years, 30 years, we've become more dependent on NHS funding and we earn less from other sources. And that is clear that anyone who wants to keep afloat will be considering private services that can keep them afloat. Now, of course, we in principle should be paid the full cost by the NHS for the services we deliver for patients. Of course we should, but if you're in business, it's a sensible thing to say, how can I use the NHS contract to also build on it to provide private services as well? So I would say that as I go around the country and listen to people, an awful lot of people are obviously doing that. And that would seem to me the right strategy. The danger for government is we say to them, and you'll end up with the same problem you've got with dentists, which is people can't get NHS funded dentistry.
Are you saying that to the government?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's the risk.
I think that's where this is headed. Headed because when I mentioned dentists earlier on, the reason why dentists why there are not a lot of NHS dentists is not because they've effectively turned their back against whatever they were being offered. And that's where this is headed. And it's good if you mention that to the government, that is a risk, and that will be a real risk of what's going to happen.
Yeah. That's the risk.
Okay. Just moving on to independent prescribing, then it's gone into CPCF. Just sort of wrapping up now. I think you mentioned in your statement when you announced it. Do we have any more details on what that would look like and the structure around it in terms of independent prescribing coming into CPCF, or do we not know yet?
So the government, department and NHS England are working through, and I think it will come out fairly soon, the governance and assurance framework for the service. We are talking to them all of the time. We are also discussing, obviously part of it is to enable independent prescribers to prescribe within Pharmacy First and contraception to replace PGDs, but also they were talking about including 5 new conditions. That is still being discussed and challenged, I suppose. But that would need to go through approval by a clinical, the NHS England clinical reference group. So that's a kind of clinical approval it will need to go through. So there's quite a lot more detail to come through for contractors to have a look at. It is onerous. It's not straightforward. It will be quite a big commitment to take on the service. And, we were very clear about our concerns, which is it's underfunded in the contract. And so we were pretty cautious about recommending full on to go for it, because I think contractors will have to think really seriously about it. The structure of the payments isn't sufficient for the workload. For example, giving £17 for an IP consult is ludicrous. So we're completely unimpressed by any of that. So I think it will be up to contractors to see whether it's actually economic to take part in that service, or whether it's more economic to use IPs in private services.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. And then just pharmacy and 10-year plan. Obviously, the government's 10-year plans in development at the minute. And one of the things that sort of caught my attention there, it says the community pharmacy should be central to neighboring health. Now, should be and will be are 2 different things. Are you at the table on those conversations? And what role will pharmacy play?
Yeah, so the 10-year plan was published last year, and there was some concern that it was losing momentum within government, and that's partly because they haven't got enough money for it. So that was the concern about it. Obviously, yeah, the 10-year plan said community pharmacy is integral to neighbourhood health. We work very closely with all the LPCs, so we have been hearing how neighbourhoods have been developed in the 42 sites that are being piloted now, and we've been hearing how that's developed. And what I would say is the challenge of that is that each one is entirely different. So some may be more hospital-led, some may be more PCN-led. And the real challenge is that in reality, what the neighbourhood plan talks about is pharmacists, not community pharmacy. And our concern is that is in many areas will end up being like a PCN-Rs model, where they're using the pharmacists and PCNs to help deliver it, and that it doesn't even engage or properly involve community pharmacy at all. So I was at a meeting 2 days ago where Claire Fuller was talking about neighbourhood plan and made the point about the access points to the NHS, the assets you have of community pharmacies in the high street, and are you using those assets to make neighbourhood health successful? And, you know, we had a bit of a scratchy conversation about that, because it's clear that community farming is not embedded in many of the neighbourhood plans, and I think that's going to be a struggle. Having said that, I think it really depends what they are delivering, because what she was talking about was neighbourhoods focusing on, say, 1% of the population with high acuity needs, comorbidities, you know, like older people or very vulnerable people who may be on 6 to 8 medications, who may be needing a combination of GPs, physios and social care. Then is there really a role for community pharmacy in that? I don't know. So my concern is that it's not a fully funded development. You know, it's not been fully embedded. There is a risk that it won't work, and there is a risk that community pharmacy is ignored or outside of it. So all of those things are a big concern for us, but working very closely with the LPCs, and we're raising it with NHS England to see how meaningful neighbourhood is going to be. But the jury's out as to whether it's going to be a lasting change to the system and it's going to work.
Okay. Thank you for that. So before we close, I usually just sort of wrapping up now. I always put listener questions out to my guests. And these are from real listeners, sort of from the PTC community. And if you're listening to this episode and you do have any questions you'd like us to put to our guests, a future guest, just drop us a message and we'll find the right guest and ask the questions. We've got the relevant or right guest that can answer it. Before I go into listener questions, I've got 2 for you. One from me, for you, Janet. So obviously you've been in the sector for over 4 years now. What do you see that people who grew up in pharmacy struggle to see? And honestly, what gives you hope about community pharmacy? So you've got this outside lens, haven't you? What do you see that we struggle to see?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What does the sector struggle to see? I wouldn't say, I would say, sometimes from my perspective, it's understanding how the policy world works and how government works. So I sometimes meet contractors who assume that all ministers and all civil servants are evil or dreadful people or scam artists or something. And I obviously wouldn't be good at my job if I walked around with that kind of, I would say, disrespectful view of other professionals. So I think that's sometimes a mistake. And I think the other mistake, I sort of mentioned it earlier, and that this isn't a criticism, but I would say sometimes is not to verse their issues with the issues of patients and communities. And I think, you know, that should be number one. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves. But I don't, honestly, the thing I'm massively impressed by is all of those different plates that pharmacies are spinning all of the time, because they're clinical professionals, they're pharmacists, they're caring for their patients, they're talking to their patients, they're navigating new regulations, complex rules and regulations, and they're also spending half their life trying to get hold of medication. They're trying to keep a business afloat. They're trying to be a good employer and to plan for the future. So the number of plates and the skills that at any one time pharmacy owners are juggling, that's massively impressive. I don't think I've seen that anywhere else as clearly in all the other areas of work that I've done. That's really impressive, and the enterprise and commitment that people have is just astonishing. So I don't know how many people keep going and doing what they're doing, but the real value, I love visiting pharmacies, not always so that people don't always want to be recognized.
You need to visit one of our branches when you're up this way.
I definitely come. I love to visit pharmacies, but I've always loved to visit pharmacies, and I think that's the thing I really love about them, is that I can go in anywhere and I'm going to get help and advice from people who really care about their community. So I think that's really important.
That's great to hear. So the first question from the listener then says, what leadership qualities do you think community pharmacy leaders will need most in the years ahead?
Will need most in the years ahead. Okay, I think that in terms of leadership, it's really important to have an idea about where you're going and what you're trying to achieve. And I think to go forwards with that with sort of openness, honesty and integrity is really important. I think it's also really important that we need to balance the professional clinical skills and reflect those in everything we're talking about, and to show and demonstrate the value of how those professional clinical skills are applied in the work that we do, because I think it's really important we're not just seen as businesses, we're seen as a vital part of the health system, the most accessible part of the health system. But I think we're also going to have an awful lot of creativity and insight, because one of the areas I don't fully know how that will work out, but what's the meaning of robotization, digitization, AI in healthcare? How is the world going to change, and how will people change in the way that they engage with health, and how will we give patients the right access to our businesses to enable them to be able to manage their own health as well as be treated by the health system? So I would say that's one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit, is where are we going in terms of kind of futureology of digitization, all those things. What does that mean for the future? And I think in the longer term, that's really what we've got to think about. What will it look like? Because people, and having worked with older people value people interactions. So how will we keep that while still recognizing that our business models will have to change over time? So that's what they're going to have to weigh up. It's not going to be an easy job because none of us know the answers yet.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the second question, as chief executive of Community Pharmacy England, what achievements are you most proud of so far?
I guess what I'm proud of is all of the things that we've done over the last few years to raise the profile of community pharmacy, to have a direction of travel, to promote the economic and social value of the sector. So having a vision and doing all of that work. I'm proud of CPE in the fact that we pushed really hard to get an independent economic review that showed the real value of what we do. And I'm pleased that since then, we've had a much higher profile as well over the last few years in terms of we were mentioned in all the major political parties' manifestos the last election. First time ever. We've never been mentioned in any. Right. So we've got a higher profile, and that has led to getting over £1 billion of extra money for the sector, and that's without the write-offs. So I'm proud that we feel like we might be able to start turning the tide, and that there is much more awareness of the value of community pharmacy.
Thank you, Janet. And that's it. We're closing off. Is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with? Anything at all that you want to tell the listeners?
No, I think the final thing to say is I'm one individual, within an organisation, and my organisation is about 35 to 40 people, but ultimately it's the committee who are contractors. And I just want people to know, whenever they think CPE somewhere else over there or a distance from them, that every single person who weighs up the decisions we make is a contractor just like them, from a whole range of different types of contractor. So they feel exactly the same things: the passions, anger, frustrations, pleasure of serving patients. They feel exactly the same as other contractors. So we're not in another world, we're in exactly the same world as them. And that I think probably the thing I'm most impressed with is how much time and dedication those people give to a difficult job. So hats off to my committee members. They do an amazing job.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. I know you've got a very busy schedule. And I really do like the honesty as well of the conversation. It was very real. It was honest and substantial. And it was genuinely useful to the contractors listening. I certainly found it useful for myself. To our listeners, thank you once again for being here. If anything in today's conversation has sparked your curiosity or questions that you have, or something that you want to discuss, please feel free to get in touch to us. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do share it, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the like button as well. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best prescription for success is resilience. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.